Greetings and welcome to another installation of our Introduction to Buddhism series. I'm Aaron Proffitt. I'm Associate Professor of Japanese Studies at University of Albany. Feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments or other topics you'd like to get into with this series. A few months ago, we got together to do an introduction to Korean Buddhism. I felt like it went pretty well, and then I looked down and saw that I had not hit record, and that made me so sad. So we're going to try this again. This time I'm definitely recording, and I'm looking forward to getting into this material. Now, Korean Buddhism is often left out of the conversation, in part because of how central China has been. I mean, the name China, Zhongguo is Central Kingdom. And then the profound international influence of Japanese Buddhism, especially in the early modern period. So Korea tends to get squeezed out, but Korea is really, really important for the development of Buddhism in China as well as Japan, and today is increasingly relevant internationally. So Korean Buddhism is a great thing to spend your time working on, and yeah, let's jump into it. So the first, okay, so first things first, when we're thinking about Korean Buddhism, we have to think of it as part of a broader cultural matrix. Religious traditions don't exist or function on their own. They are expressed through and function within particular social and cultural contexts. So it's not simply isolated Buddhist missionaries leaving China or wherever and going to Korea, but rather Buddhism was something that Korean elites sought out because by this time it was part of the broader cultural package of what it meant to be civilized in East Asia. So Chinese architecture, writing, calligraphical sciences, medicine, government bureaucracy. Nowadays in English, bureaucracy is a kind of a bad word, but at this time, having a functioning bureaucracy means you have water, you have rice, you have the things you need to survive. And again, so what it meant to be civilized in East Asia at this time also included thriving Buddhist temples and a sangha that could, support those temples. So we'll get into kind of how that develops in the Korean Peninsula. In my investigation into Korean Buddhism, one of the terms that keeps popping up is Tongbulgyo, meaning holistic Buddhism. And I think we'll see that finding a balanced view so that the diversity of Buddhism can all, everything functions together, seems to be one of the core ideas in the Korean Buddhist worldview. So, all right, setting the stage, we have the Koguryo, which is the early centralized state. This important King Sosurim establishes Korean Confucian academies. Confucianism is a major force throughout East Asia, perhaps especially in the case of Korea, but also Buddhism and Taoism also come to flourish in Korea at this time. Down here at the bottom, we have the Baekje Kingdom, and during a period of strife, they were dispatching Buddhist images as a way to establish connections with the kingdom, the Yamato Kingdom or the Kingdom of Wa down here in Japan. Those are not necessarily the same thing, but it's anyway. It's beside the point. So Buddhism was an important part of diplomacy, right? We got to get over thinking about religion as its own thing, apart from economics and politics. It's very much integrated into all of that. So Baekje, in trying to rally support from the kingdoms on the archipelago, are sending Buddha images to establish that relationship. And I think that's really interesting. Early Japanese Buddhism is basically Korean Buddhism and kind of transplanted. And then eventually a lot of emissaries are sent to China to try to learn more about Buddhism. And then eventually Japanese Buddhism as well develops into its own thing, just like we'll see in Korea. This King Bopyeong eventually retires to the monastery, which again sets a precedent that we see in the rest of East Asia, where sometimes a king will retire from the political life to go live in the temples. But sometimes from that space, they may still be involved in politics in some form or fashion, which is something I always think is very interesting, right? So Moving on. One of the important early thinkers in Korean Buddhism is Wisong. Wisong is a great transmitter of the Huayan school. So we have the Avatamsaka Sutra, which is kind of at the pinnacle of the school of thought called Huayan, which we might know in Japan as Kegon. So this is a doctrinal sutra-based tradition, which ends up becoming extremely influential across East Asia, but also in, especially in Korea, I gather. The Avatamsaka Sutra, which we can get into more later, is very focused on interconnectedness and the idea that the microcosm can encapsulate the macrocosm, and that the macrocosm, the universe, can be expressed within, the part and the whole are mutually inclusive, and everything in existence abides in a complex interconnected relationship with every other thing. And this is fundamental Buddhist stuff. Nothing is permanent. Nothing exists independently. Everything exists in a complex web of causes and conditions. And it has famously been said that Zen is the Avatamsaka Sutra in practice, and the Avatamsaka Sutra is Zen in theory. And perhaps this is something that we can see in the case of Korean Buddhism as well, but we'll get into that more in a moment. Next, we have Wonhyo. Wonhyo was one of my favorite people, and I'll talk about why in a moment. He is perhaps one of the most influential and important thinkers in Korean Buddhism. The collected works of Korean Buddhism, which you can find online, Volume 1 is all about Wonhyo, and they really established that here's someone who really set the foundation for what we think about as Korean Buddhism. One of the texts that he was really interested in was the awakening of faith in the Mahayana. They saw this as a way to help organize the diversity of Chinese Buddhist thought. The monk Fazang was one of the early systematizers of Huayan thought, and Wonhyo drew upon him very heavily. When he was a young monk, he wanted to go study Yogacara, Huayan, and other stuff in China. However, he ran into some difficulty. So Wonhyo and his friend Wisong are en route to China, and they're blown off course. They have to take shelter in a cave. So exhausted they are so exhausted from the journey, from the storm that has just beaten them up, that they're relieved to find in this cave a gourd filled with crystal clear water. So they take a sip, go to sleep. Well, the next morning they wake up and realize the cave is not a cave. The cave is a tomb. And the gourd that had the crystal clear water is not a gourd, but a skull. And that crystal clear water was brackish runoff inside this tomb or whatever. So here we have Wonhyo dancing in delight while holding this skull. What is it about this realization that was so inspiring to him? Okay. What Wonhyo realized is that, yeah, he could go study abroad. He could go to China. He could study with these great masters. But if his mind is itself so easily fooled by change in circumstance, it doesn't matter where he goes. He needs to focus on this mind that can create this reality. So he'll stay put, is basically what happens. So he joyously decides that, hey, I'm going to stay put. He returns to lay life, but continues as a lay Buddhist teacher. He travels around playing on his lute, teaches people the chanting of the Yombo, which we might know in Chinese as Nianfo, Japanese as Nembutsu, Sanskrit Buddhanusmriti. So the recitation of the name of Buddha as a form of practice. So something that he teaches in bars and brothels, playing his music and just teaching people. And I think that's an interesting pairing, because so many of the great figures in East Asian history are these austere monastics, but Wonhyo is one of these people that kind of breaks the mold and goes off and does his own thing while continuing to produce great works on Buddhism. His buddy Wisong, though, good student, he goes to study abroad. Now, of course, when I'm presenting this to a room full of undergraduates, I don't want them to say, oh, I don't need to go study abroad. I can learn everything right here by focusing on the mind. No, go study abroad, go do all that. That's important as well. But this episode also reminds me of this one SNL skit where a guy is, goes on vacation, goes to Italy, and that'll fix it. And it's like, no, now I'm just depressed in Italy. So going somewhere, doing some new thing isn't going to change you if you don't change within first, right? So that's kind of the lesson of this. Now, some of the basic features of Wonhyo's thought, again, I've already mentioned the Avatamsaka Sutra. It's very influential in Korean Buddhism, very influential in East Asian Buddhism in general. And I like to think of it as having kind of a unity and diversity. There's this balance, that there is this organic whole to the universe, but there's also a way that all things function together. So one of the terms we often hear is interconnectedness. There's another term, interpenetration, but some feminist scholars have proposed mutual enfolding as another way of thinking about it. And I really like that one, that mutual enfolding, that everything is, kind of connecting with everything else and nothing is separate. But one of the other schools of thought that Wonhyo is really influenced by is Yogacara. And the way that I like to think about Yogacara is like this. It's not that the outside world doesn't exist, but you don't see it because everything you see and imagine is being filtered through your consciousness. I like to imagine it like, imagine you have a big fishbowl on your head and walking around through your life, you bump into it. Now it's getting all smudgy. And over time, it gets foggy, gets smudgy. You're not seeing clearly. Okay? The Yogacara analysis of consciousness, eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, mental consciousness gives rise to the nature of the conception of self and so on. There's this perfuming of karmic seeds in our storehouse consciousness that we carry with us lifetime to lifetime. Now, this is not a self, this is not a soul. This is a kind of a causation repository of our karmic flow. And by learning how the mind works, you can kind of break down that process and, maybe clean this fishbowl that we're inhabiting, or perhaps even take it off entirely and see the world as it is. That's what becoming a Buddha is. So you could think of Yogacara as a kind of Buddhist psychology. It's very, very complex, very subtle, but it's very cool. All right. Next, we have the concept of the one mind. The one mind we can think of as the mind of the Buddha and the mind of all sentient beings as ultimately being one and the same. But obviously, from our limited human perspective, we don't see all of that. We see diversity, we see suffering, we see all of this other stuff. But from the perspective of Buddha, it's all oneness. It's all interconnected. This idea of one mind also leads to the harmonization of ultimate reality and provisional reality. We have the big picture, ultimate reality, that would be emptiness, nirvana, Buddha reality, Dharmakaya, whatever we want to call it. Then we have provisional reality, and that provisional reality is an aspect of reality, and even in its flaws, it is part of reality, but it's one piece of the puzzle, let's say. This is an interesting term, Huajong, reconciling disputes and harmonization. There was generally no sectarianism in East Asian Buddhism, but you would occasionally have people who would say, my view is the best view, or my tradition's encapsulation of Buddhism is the most effective, whether it's Tiantai or Huayan or whatever, right? So, for example, in the Tiantai system, there's the 5 times and the 8 teachings. So the 5 times begins with the Avatamsaka Sutra. This is, so in Tiantai tradition, Juri says that the sudden teachings are when the Buddha achieves awakening and he expresses the Avatamsaka Sutra, but only high-level bodhisattvas can understand that. So then he has to simplify things with the agamas, or the non-Mahayana sutras, then the Mahayana sutras, and then the perfection of wisdom sutras, and then I believe I got that right, and then the ultimate teaching, the perfect teaching, which would be the Lotus Sutra or the Nirvana Sutra. So for the Tiantai tradition, they really focus on the Lotus and the Nirvana Sutra. Later interpreters look at this and go, wait a minute, if the Avatamsaka Sutra is first, that must be the most important. So then they'd focus on this. So you have these different schools of thought that might focus on a particular practice or might focus on a particular teaching. And while in general, people study broadly and practice various things, sometimes people do get stuck in particular positions, say, no, my school has the right way. Okay. Now, these different doctrinal organization systems, like we see in Tiantai or Huayan or whatever, they develop because Buddhists in China are trying to figure out, how does the diversity of Buddhism fit together? How does all this stuff make sense? Does it make sense? In Korean Buddhism, they're dealing with a similar problem. Chinese Buddhism, by this point, is already very diverse. So how does that diversity fit together? And one strategy that is employed in various places, various traditions, is trying to figure out how to harmonize all this stuff. How to think about truth as having many different levels. Provisional truth, ultimate truth. Maybe the teaching A is a provisional teaching and teaching B is the ultimate teaching. So people try to figure out how these all fit together. And we have this basic idea that people who are stuck in doctrinal or sectarian biases need to break out of that, and that truth, with a capital T, is relative to a particular position and not absolute. In other words, each of these different perspectives, Tiantai, Huayan, Chan, etc., these all fit together. Yeah, they're not opposed to one another. Again, we have the term Tongbulgyo. I mentioned holistic Buddhism. Another way of translating it is integrated Buddhism, which again sees Buddhist diversity as part of a comprehensive system. And this, according to some people, is still how Korean Buddhism functions today. All right. The next big wave of Chinese Buddhist development that makes its way to China is Seon, which we might know as Chan or Zen Buddhism. I was very lucky. So through grad school, one of the problems is that I'm moving around constantly. Study Japanese here, study Chinese there, go here, go there. But one of the good things about that is it gave me an opportunity to practice and experience a lot of different kinds of Buddhist traditions. So Japanese Renzai and Soto, Korean Son. When I lived in Ann Arbor, I went to the Ann Arbor Zen Buddhist temple, but they practice in the Korean tradition. So actually it's Son, but nobody in America knows what Seon is, so they call it Zen. Kind of funny, right? But in that place, I got to understand a bit about what Seon Buddhism is really all about. How is it different or similar to Japanese Zen or Chinese Chan? Being able to get some hands-on stuff, I was able to learn this. So one of the great books on Korean Buddhism is The Zen Monastic Experience by Robert Buswell. And here are some of the things that he outlines about Korean Buddhism that I got to experience firsthand, and very much that Zen is not just sitting in meditation. Zen includes so many other things. So like bowing, thinking about bowing as a practice. Yeah, so the practice of meditation is like one piece of a much broader puzzle. And that's something that at the Zen temple in Ann Arbor they focus on. Is something that we see in Korean tradition more broadly. I always noticed when people would come into the temple, first thing many of them would come in and do prostrations, all the way down to the floor, raise your hands up, and standing back up again. And they would do that. And when we went for the refuge ceremony, we had to do, I believe it was 1,000 prostrations, over a certain amount of time. And then some people would save the last 108 to do the morning of the precept ceremony. And I got to go to Chicago and do that. It was really, really moving. Yeah. So some of the other practices include, of course, seated meditation. The practice of gongon, or in Japanese we call these koan, the practice of, engaging in dialogue with the teacher. The teacher maybe asks you a question, and the way you respond is often more important than the content of your response. It's not about giving the right answer in the academic sense, but rather about demonstrating your awakening, right? Gongon is not about explaining awakening to you. It's about revealing or demonstrating awakening. Yeah. There are also a lot of mantras and dharani. So we would often practice the Great Compassion dharani, dedicated to the Bodhisattva Avalokiteshvara. And then also here's this term yombul again. So in Chinese Nianfo, in Japanese Nembutsu. So you could say Namo Amida Bul. Now at the temple that I went to, so one of the really common ones you would see is Namo Amida Bul, which is Namo Amitofo in Chinese, Namo Amida Butsu in Japanese. Namo Ai Dafa in Vietnam. This is a practice that's all over. One of my professors used to be a monk in Korea, came to America, became a college professor, and then his teacher from Korea sent him a present, and it just so happened to be a scroll of the name of the Buddha Amitabha, Namo Amitabha. So this is just part of the tradition. Now, at the Korean temple that I used to go to, they would practice the name of Avalokiteshvara, Namo Kwanseon Posal, which in Japanese would be Namo Kwanseon Bosatsu. Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting that was the form of yombo that we practice, was chanting the name of the Bodhisattva of compassion. There's many, it could be the medicine Buddha. So yombo is not limited to the Buddha Amitabha. That's just the most popular form, I guess. And then also sutra study, recitation, copying. In many cases, the focus is on the Avatamsaka Sutra. That has been in my experience, as well as other things that I've read. So Seon becomes a major force within Korean Buddhism. One of the great systematizers of Seon in Korea is Jinul. So Robert Buswell, I mentioned his book, The Zen Monastic Experience. He's also done a lot of work on Jinul. You can see these two different ways of spelling it, with a J, with a CH. There are different romanization systems for East Asian languages, and this, the one used today, I believe, uses the J, but then the older one uses the CH. So in any case, Jinul is really inspired by an important exegete, a lay scholar named Li Tongxuan, who argued that Seon's sudden enlightenment, we have the sudden gradual enlightenment debate within Zen Buddhism, basically arguing that these could be harmonized through studying the Avatamsaka Sutra. Here is one of the big questions, which I gather is based on people's experience living in community together. You'll see some people who maybe don't practice a lot, like Hui Nung from the Platform Sutra. He's an illiterate cook, and boom, he has this awakening. Whereas other people are diligent and practice and all this and don't. So is awakening something that's sudden, spontaneous, natural, or is it something you have to gradually work towards? Is it both? Is it neither? Is it something else? This is a debate that we see all throughout, Chan in China, Seon in Korea, and Zen in Japan. So Jinul really advocates for this balanced approach to these. And another dichotomy that we often see is the conflict between meditation and study, or Son and Gyo. Gyo study, that again, this is often going to be focused on the Avatamsaka Sutra. Son, this Chan or Zen meditation. And I think it's so as a scholar, as someone who is a professional scholar of Buddhism, I think this is really interesting, because even in the academy, you see people who want to emphasize one or the other. If you don't have the meditative insight, you can't really understand the text. If you don't understand the text, you can't really understand or progress in meditation. And this debate goes round and round. The way that this ends up getting settled in Korea seems to be that you study so that you study the words of the Buddha, so that through meditation you can eventually realize the mind of the Buddha. So I think Jinul kind of helps set this up. There's no real conflict, but how you understand that balance can be complicated. Okay. One of the main practices in Korean Buddhism is a hwadu, the kind of key phrase of a koan or a gongan, where you're observing or you meditate upon the kind of, I don't want to say punchline, but like the main point of a koan, whether it's the character for nothingness, or one of the really popular ones is what is it? So you meditate upon that question, like what is existence? What is the mind? What is it? Right? And then you just let that question sit with you. Right? You sit with it and allow the question to open your mind in a particular way. Yeah. All right. So the Songgwangsa Temple, very important for the Jogye, the dominant school of Buddhism in Korea. Very important, very connected with Jinul. All right. So moving on, Buddhist temples are major centers, major landholding institutions, sometimes rivaling political power. And here's something really interesting you see in Buddhist history, is that sometimes temples will outlast political regimes. And if you know anything about Confucianism, they don't want to share power. The king should be on top, the government should be on top, and we often see Confucians complaining about kings giving money to temples when they should be, using it on something else, whatever. So when the Goryeo collapses and the Joseon begins, this happens sometimes where the previous regime was very much supported by Buddhist temples, so the new regime goes after the Buddhist temples. We see this in the Meiji period in Japan. We see this, every now and again, you'll get a Buddhist or Taoist or Confucian king, and then they're really into one and not the other, and then they'll, persecute that. So this is what happens in the Joseon, right? Land and resources are taken from temples, and temples are no longer allowed in cities. And then eventually things are consolidated, so you have the Son schools and the doctrinal schools. But again, there's harmony is the dominant thing here. Moving on. Okay, so Buddhist temples are essentially cut out of mainstream intellectual culture, which comes to be dominated by Confucianism, and then later on Christianity, which, how Korea becomes such a Christian dominant country is something that is complicated and deserves a whole other lecture unto itself. A lot of it has to do with contemporary politics and strategic incorporation of Christian values into Korean politics, but also it has to do with the fact that when missionaries show up in the cities in Korea, the Confucians are pretty amenable to what they're selling, and there's no Buddhist to compete with. Whereas in China, Japan, and many other countries, that kind of soteriological or salvation-driven perspective is dominated by Buddhism, and it's often hard for Christianity to get in, whereas in Korea, the situation is very different. But then, this is very interesting, Toyotomi Hideyoshi decides that, now that Japan is, coming to be unified, he wants to invade the Korean peninsula too. Japan is a resource-poor country. That was not going to happen, but sometimes considered to be very egotistical, and he wanted to go out there. But what's interesting, right? So the Buddhist monks have been kicked out of the cities, so now they're out in the country, they're out in the mountains. So as Hideyoshi is working his way through the Korean peninsula, Buddhist temples are able to organize and fight back to stop the invasion, disrupting supply lines and things like that. So one of the leaders of this at this time is Hyojong, who we'll talk about more in a moment, and his two followers, Yujong and Yongguang, and they help organize the monks in the countryside to stop this invasion. So it's interesting, right? Like the politicians kick the monks out of the cities, the monks come back and help, stop this invasion. It's very interesting, I think. All right. Hyojong again sets up this balance between gyo or study, son, practice, meditation. So what he says is son is the Buddha's mind, doctrine is the Buddha's word. This is page 295, Collected Works of Korean Buddhism, volume 3. Says that the differences arise due to differences in an audience's needs and the presenter's tactics, right? It was understood that the Buddha was a great teacher and would provide just the right teaching for a person's particular circumstances, right? Just as a different ailment or medical problem will need a different cure, same thing, problems of the mind require different teachings, yeah? But he would say that the doctrine ultimately leads to the true mind of the Buddha, and that the difference between study and practice is understanding versus experiencing. And anytime that I've taught a class and I can explain, hey, here's what Korean Buddhism looks like, or Japanese Buddhism, or Chinese Buddhism, actually going to a temple, sitting down and smelling the incense and hearing the gong, feeling the reverberation of the gong in your chest, tasting the tea at the end of a long day of meditating, all these great things. Is it different? Like I can describe it to you, but if you go experience it for yourself, that's a different thing. Yeah. All right, we've already talked about that. All right, so in the modern period, Japan modernizes very quickly in response to pressure from the West, and invades Korea, colonizes Korea, and as part of their efforts in Korea, they allow the monks back into the cities with government control of the Sangha. One of the things that remains really controversial is that after the Meiji period in Japan, monks in Japan can or are required to marry. So they do kind of the same thing in Korea, and there remains an order of Korean Buddhism that still practices this married clergy thing that came from the Japanese, whereas the Jogye order does not. So that was kind of controversial. Also, under Japanese colonialism, they tried to impose the Japanese sectarian model onto Korean culture, but it didn't work like that. Japanese sectarianism is really unique, and the rest of East Asia, you might sit Zen, have an esoteric dadani or mantra, pray for the Buddha Amitabha to greet you on your deathbed, etc., etc. It's not parceled out in the way that we might see things in Japan. The legacy of Japanese colonialism is complicated. Obviously, there's a lot of bad stuff that happens under colonialism, but there are also some interesting things, like, for example, monks being allowed back in the cities, and the way that Korean Buddhism modernized. It's not so unambiguously bad. It's complicated, right? So here's a really interesting book that came out not too long ago. Hwan Sung Kim, I believe he's at Yale. Empire of the Dharma. I would highly recommend you check that out as well. Now, in my opinion, some of the most interesting scholarship coming out in Buddhist studies is about Buddhist women. And Jean Park, a Korean Buddhist philosopher, has done a lot of work on this nun named Kim Il-ryop. Kim Il-ryop was an important and very interesting Buddhist thinker in modern Korea, and someone I always enjoyed teaching about and reading her material. So Kim Il-ryop was the daughter of a Christian pastor and was very critical of the ideas of duality that we find within Christianity, this stark dichotomy, heaven and hell, God and humans, creator and created. Again, she really sought this unified view. She had a lot of tragedy in her life, family members dying and so on. That led her to question. And what she ended up doing was discovering Buddhism and really flourishing in that. She is interesting for a lot of different reasons. She's a soul master, but then she talks about love and past relationships, and in the very traditional Confucian Korean culture, she was controversial because she was married 3 times, was divorced 3 times, had a child out of wedlock. She talks about love and freedom, and kind of framing that as part of being a Buddhist woman. She published these essays in I believe it's a magazine called New Woman. She says that a Buddhist woman is not just housewives and mothers, but also politically and culturally active individuals, which is very interesting. I think we tend to think of Buddhism in East Asian culture as being kind of collectivist, but I think she's pushing back on that in a way that is very interesting. Now, something else that she talks about is this concept of chastity. And chastity is often thought of as a thing that the father owns and then the husband owns, and a woman has to protect their chastity. But she saw it in a different way, very much about freedom and about the individuality of a woman to determine her future and not have that be controlled by a man. So she critiques this idea of chastity, tries to reimagine it in a new way. Of her interesting teachings, one of the ones that I really enjoy is when she talks about the limited I, the limited self, and the absolute I. That when we recognize the limitations of ourself and break those limitations down and expand the boundaries of what the self is, we come to realize that I exists dependent upon causes and conditions in a broader context, and that's the absolute I, the I beyond limitations. I see some interesting similarities with how the Buddha Amitabha is described in some other Buddhist traditions as well. So in any case, this is my brief overview of Korean Buddhism. Let me see if I can exit the. There we go. Exit the slideshow. There we go. Okay, so that's what we have today for Korean Buddhism. There are several other fun topics within that I would love to explore and expand on. Just a day on Yogacara and Wonhyo, or just a day on Kim Il-ryop. And I think that'd be really fun sometime in the future. So thank you all for your time and attention, and look forward to making some more of these. Thank you.